International Society for Biblical Hermeneutics, and I am here with Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum of Ariel Ministries. Arnold will be speaking today on the Jewish approaches to Daniel 9:24 to 27. Arnold, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
You can take it from here.
Okay. What I could do is give a basic exposition of the key passage, which is Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. And then I will bring in some of the rabbinic expositions and so on, what there are. And then I guess at the end we open for questions. But what Daniel 9 is dealing with is Daniel has been studying the book of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah clearly prophesied that the 7 years of captivity would be finished. And when it's finished, then the Jewish people would be allowed to go back to the land. They wouldn't be forced to go back, but they're free to go back. But the assumption he made is that at the end of the 70 years, the Messianic kingdom would be established. And that's the error of conclusion he made. And so he assumed that at that point that he was reading it, the captivity has maybe about 3-4 years to go, and then would come the Messianic kingdom. And he knew from the prophets that the Messianic kingdom is inaugurated by a national confession of sin. And so what he does on behalf of Israel in most of the chapter is confess the sins of Israel in order to try to fulfill the prerequisite to the Messianic kingdom. But then the angel Gabriel was sent to him to inform him that he miscalculates. Yes, the captivity will end at the end of 7 years of captivity, but that's not when the kingdom will begin. Rather, the kingdom will begin at a different point of time. And he's then giving a specific timetable for the establishment of the kingdom. So that brings us to the key passage of Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. And he begins in verse 24 with the phrase in Hebrew, Shiv'im, or more correct, Shavuim, Shavim. Literally, it does not mean 70 weeks, as often English Bibles have rendered it, but rather it is literally 77s, because the Hebrew word for weeks would be Shavuot, but here it doesn't say Shavuot, like in the Feast of Weeks. Here it says Shavuim. So Shavuim is not weeks, but sevens. And so the two words together, Shavuim Shavim, meaning 77s, are decreed upon the Jewish people, your people, he says, and also upon your city, the city of Jerusalem. So it should be noted, it's a very Jewish context. He's dealing with a system that applies to Jewish people. It's not applicable to the Gentiles, not applicable to the church. It's specifically applicable to the Jewish people specifically. And the word sevens could be a sevens of anything, like the English word dozen. In English, you know the word dozen means 12, but 12 of what? 12 eggs, 12 loaves of bread, and the context tells you what it means. And in this case, it is 77s of something, but the context shows that Daniel had been thinking of 70 years. And so he's told, no, Daniel, not 70 years before the kingdom is established, but rather 77s, or a 490-year period, is decreed over the Jewish people, over the people of Israel, that have to be fulfilled before the Messianic kingdom can be established. And so that is the understanding of how the terms should be used. Now, Rashi, who was a key rabbinic leader in the Middle Ages, has interpreted to be a period of 490 years, but he assumed 70 years of Babylonian captivity, and then the second temple will last for 420 years, and that will begin the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. That will be the rabbinic view. One of them. We'll discuss some others as we proceed. And so that is the starting point. Now, dealing with the the next statement, he says, 77s are decreed. And the Hebrew word literally means to be cut off or to be determined. To be cut off or to be determined. So a total of 490 years is to be cut out of the theme of the book of Daniel as a whole. The Daniel's theme was the times of the Gentiles, and he had already spelled out, especially in chapter 2 and chapter 7, that there'll be 4 Gentile empires arising, one after the other. And so these are the 4 Gentile empires he'll be dealing with. But out of this long period of time, of the times of the Gentiles that began with the removal of the last Davidic king of Jerusalem, who was Zedekiah, until a Davidic king is again established upon the throne of David, who will be the Messiah, there'll be this period of 490 years cut out of the long time of the times of the Gentiles. And that's going to be necessary before the final restoration of Israel. There'll be an initial restoration in return from Babylonia, but the final restoration won't come until this 490-year period is concluded. And the central program of the 77s is again the Jewish people. He's told your people, Daniel's people, these were Jewish people, and that your holy city, Daniel's holy city, and that would be Jerusalem. And this will involve both the first coming of the Messiah and the second coming of the Messiah. But the program of the 77s does not involve the church. That's important to note. The church has no role in these 77s. The second part of verse 24 now deals with the purpose of the 77s. And the purpose of the 77s is to accomplish 6 specific things. The first 3 are going to be negative, undesirable elements that need to be dealt with. And then these elements will be removed. And then 3 other elements, which are desirable elements, elements to be effected. And the positives are responses to the negatives. So for example, the first negative is responded to by the first positive, that would be number 1 and 4. The second negative will be responded to by the second positive, that would be numbers 2 and 5. And the third negative will be responded to by the third positive, that will be numbers 3 and 6. And so this is the thing we need to enumerate, understand clearly what the intent of the 77s is intended to accomplish. So number 1, to finish transgression. The Hebrew word for finish means to restrain firmly, to restrain completely, to bring on completion, or to bring to completion. The term transgression, the Hebrew word pasha or pesha, means to rebel. It's a rather strong word for the specific type of sin. In the Hebrew, it has an article, meaning it is not just a transgression, it is the transgression, the rebellion. And the key rebellion that must be overcome is Israel's rejection of the Messiahship of Yeshua. Messiahship of Jesus will be indicated as we go through the text. It had been prophesied that Israel would reject the Messiah previous to Daniel's writings in Isaiah chapter 53, verses 1 through 9. After Daniel came Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, that Israel would reject the first coming of the Messiah. So this specific transgression is to come under firm control. It will no longer flourish. And so Israel's apostasy and national sin is to be restrained. Also predicted by Isaiah previously, in Isaiah chapter 59, verse 20, and that's what Paul indicates in Romans 11, in verse 24-25, in that ultimately that sin will be restrained. Now the second purpose of the 77s is to make an end of sins. The Hebrew word for to make an end, kele, means to seal up or to shut up in prison. In fact, it's the modern Israeli Hebrew word for the imprisonment, but should mean or does mean to be securely kept, to be securely locked up, and not to be allowed to roam and to flourish. And there are going to be different degrees of restraints. The Hebrew word for sin is the Hebrew word hatah, which means to miss the mark. This deals with sins in the early life or in the daily life. Sins would come to an end. Sins would be taken away. It's also important to remember that if we miss the mark, we hit the wrong one. If you miss the right mark, you hit the wrong mark. And this point was already predicted before the time of Daniel in Isaiah chapter 27, verse 9, Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 25 to 27, Ezekiel chapter 37, verse 23, and at the time of Daniel, in Romans 11, verse 27. And furthermore, in the same book that gave Daniel the stimulus, the 7 years of the captivity will soon end, is also where Jeremiah predicted the coming of a new covenant in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34, that when the covenant is finally applied to Israel as a nation, then all the sins will be removed. And then the third obligation is to intend to be fulfilled in the 77s, is to make reconciliation for iniquity. The Hebrew word rendered in English as reconciliation is the Hebrew word kafar, which means to make atonement. To make atonement. It is the means by which the first two things would be accomplished, by making an atonement. And the atonement is for iniquity, and that deals with the sin nature. And so we're dealing with the specific sin of rebellion, rejecting the Messiah, the daily sins enough, but the sin nature is part of the need to accomplish the 77s. Now, the fourth purpose of the 77s is to bring in everlasting righteousness, to bring in an age of righteousness. Ultimately, that becomes the Messianic kingdom. And the prophets have clearly labeled the Messianic kingdom to be the kingdom of righteousness 3 times in Isaiah, chapter 1, verse 26, chapter 11, verses 2 through 5, chapter 32, verse 17, twice in Jeremiah, Jeremiah 23, verses 5 and 6, and Jeremiah 33, verses 15 through 18. And the fifth goal is to seal up vision and prophecy. To seal up, again, the same Hebrew word kela is used, to seal up, to shut up, to cause a cessation, to keep imprisoned, or to completely fulfill. The term vision applies to oral prophecy, but the word prophecy, it deals with written prophecy. And so there'll be a cessation of both oral prophecy and written prophecy. There'll be the final fulfillment of all revelations and prophecies that have not as yet been fulfilled, and their functions will finally be fulfilled fully with the second coming of the Messiah. And so these things will finish at that time. Now, the sixth element is to anoint the most holy. And the Hebrew literally reads, a most holy something. And it's usually the term place is used, but refers specifically to what Daniel's contemporary prophet had prophesied in detail, the building of the millennial temple, the building of the Messianic temple of the Messianic kingdom, and that will be the most holy place. So this is the emphasis of chapter 24, verse 24 of chapter 9. But now we need to know what will be the starting point of the 77s. So he begins in verse 25 with a statement, know therefore and discern that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem. This is the starting point of the 77, a decree being issued involving the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. Now the problem is, which of this decree is he referring to? There are basically four options. The first option, chronologically speaking, would be the decree of Cyrus. Cyrus, the emperor of Persia and the Medo-Persian Empire, that was issued in the year 538, 537 BC, and is mentioned in 2 Chronicles, chapter 36, verses 22 and 23, Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and Ezra chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, and it focuses specifically on the rebuilding of the temple. A second option is the decree of Darius Hystaspes issued in the year 521, mentioned in Ezra chapter 6, verses 6 to 12. It's a reaffirmation of the Cyrus decree and also concerns the finishing of the temple. The third possibility is the decree of Artaxerxes to Ezra issued in the year 458 BC and detailed in Ezra chapter 7, verses 11 through 26, and this contains permission to proceed with the temple service. And concerns not the building of the temple, which by then had been built, but to proceed with the service itself. And then you have the more popular one in the evangelical circles, the decree of Artaxerxes to Nehemiah, issued in the year 444 BC. And that concerns the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. Now, between these four options, the ones that only have real validity is either the first one or the fourth one. All of them did contribute not only to the rebuilding of the temple, it also did contribute to the rebuilding of Jerusalem. As the bottom line comes down to which of these two major ones are going to be the one to start with. I'll deal with the two of them and I'll give you my conclusion, though it's not part of the majority view. But years ago, a man named Sir Robert Anderson wrote a commentary on the book of Daniel, and he concluded with an AD 32 crucifixion, and he felt that this is going to be the one that will fulfill Daniel's prophecy, the decree that will begin the 77s. However, he miscalculated as to how to relate this to the Feast of Passover and so on. So there came a subsequent book by one of my seminary professors, Harold Horner, who realized he made a one-year mistake and he didn't have all the figures necessary to know when did Passover begin and things of that nature. He concluded then that he simply made a one-year error, and what he did was moved the crucifixion to AD 33, not AD 32. AD 32 is not an option. The two only options is AD 30 or AD 33. So he chose the AD 33 option, and he had calculated that that is the thing that would start the 7 years, and it concludes not with the 77s, but the first 69 sevens, specifically with the triumphal entry. Now, my observation is that nothing in the text requires the 69 sevens to end the triumphal entry. There's no implication of that. There is no real decree in Nehemiah 2, verses 1 through 8. It's only a permit or permission to rebuild the wall. And rebuilding the wall is not the same as rebuilding the city. And it's only a one section of the wall that needed to be reconstructed. So my own view is that the decree that's really talking about, because that is the emphasis in Scripture, is not the decree of Artaxerxes to Nehemiah, but the decree of Cyrus. And this is a real decree. This is the one given the same year as the vision of the 77s that will come to Daniel. It is also the decree that is emphasized prophetically twice already. Isaiah the prophet, who was well before the time of Daniel, twice mentioned by name that Cyrus, a man named Cyrus, will free the Jewish people of Babylonian captivity and permit them to return to land. And the first time it's mentioned by name, Isaiah 44, verse 28, and the second time, Isaiah chapter 45, verses 1 and 13. And the fulfillment of the Cyrus decree is emphasized in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 22 and 23, Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, Ezra chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, and Ezra 6, verses 6 to 12. And we know that this decree did include the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and we see this in Isaiah chapter 44, verse 28, and Isaiah chapter 45, verse 13. And it's clear from the historical records of the scriptures that Jews did rebuild the city before Nehemiah ever came to rebuild the broken down wall of the city. And so Haggai chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, 70 years before Nehemiah arrives, the Jews were already living in homes inside the city of Jerusalem. And Ezra chapter 4, verse 12, the city was being rebuilt. So the issue is, how does this fit with Persian chronology? And this is something I won't try to calculate here in this kind of a setting, or this kind of a context. But the termination would not be at the time of the triumphal entry. The termination would be unto Messiah the Prince. Now, depending on which system of Persian chronology we follow, one doesn't fit, but one does fit, the one by Ansty, A-N-S-T-Y, who did a detailed study of Persian chronology, and he deals with the Cyrus decree, and it comes to an end, but not with the triumphal entry, which is not mentioned in Daniel 9, only to the appearance of the Messiah, which approximates the timing of his birth. With that out of the way, let's talk about the first 69 sevens, because the 69 sevens are divided into 3 separate divisions. So in verse 25, the second part of verse 25, the first subdivision is 7 sevens. That's a period of 49 years. And that refers to the period of time during which Jerusalem will indeed be rebuilt. It shall be built again with street and moat, even in troublous times. Then, without any break between the first subdivision and the second subdivision, that's followed by the 62 sevens. And this is the second subdivision of the 77s, a period of 434 years. And there's no indication of a break of time between the first subdivision, the 7 sevens, the second subdivision, the 62 sevens. One just follows the other. And so there's no break in between. So putting the two together, we have 69 sevens, or a total of 483 years. And then he mentions unto Messiah the Prince. And that's the terminus, the end of the 69 sevens, not yet the 77s, but the 69 sevens. Again, that phrase does not indicate a triumphal entry, only points to his appearance, which would be more correctly the birth of the Messiah. Now, one key rabbi, again Rashi from the Middle Ages, says that this is not Messiah, but that is a reference to Cyrus. So Rashi, he's the one that not innovated, but represented the rabbinic view of that day, of his day, that this refers to Cyrus. And so interpret Isaiah 45, verse 1 and verse 13 to be the fulfillment of the 69 sevens. But the conclusion we can draw from the text, from the Cyrus decree until the birth of the Messiah, will be 483 years. And whatever way we try to calculate this, one thing is clear. It requires the first coming to arrive sometime before the year AD 70. Because in the year AD 70 is when the temple was destroyed, Jerusalem was destroyed, and so the coming of the Messiah must arrive sometime before AD 70. Whatever may be unclear, this much is very, very clear. Now, verse 26, he describes several events between the 69th seven and the 70th seven. So he says, after the 62 sevens, after the conclusion of the second subdivision of the 77s, and here where he shows a clear indication, a clear teaching, in fact, there's going to be a gap of time between the 69th seven and the 70th seven. In this gap of time, he points out 3 things are going to occur. Now, the first thing is the Messiah shall be cut off and have nothing. So the 69:7 ended with the arrival of the Messiah, but he died around the age of, somewhere between the age of 33, 36 or so. So at least the gap is at least that long. And the Hebrew for cut off means to be killed. And it occurred about 35 years, 36 years after the birth of the Messiah. And in my view, it occurred in the year AD 30, not AD 33. Now, Rashi, again, the key rabbi of the Middle Ages, says that after the 69 period, sevens, an anointed one will be cut off. And he ascribes the anointed one not to be the Messiah, but to be Agrippa II. And Agrippa II would have been the king of Judah at about that time. And the way he defines the word Mashiach, which is the normal Hebrew word for Messiah, is that this is in the context, and it should be interpreted not as the Messiah, but rather as prince or a great person. Rather as prince or a great person. So he didn't see the actual messianic implication of the passage. But he ascribes it to Agrippa II, who will die, and he shall have nothing. The Hebrew is a noun, and it means nothingness. And sticking with the meaning of the text, and it's Messianic, this is Messiah's state at the death, that when he dies, there'll be no Messianic kingdom established. The Hebrew word may also mean something else, but not for himself. In other words, the Hebrew can mean either nothingness or not for himself. Now, if we take it to be nothingness, it means that at the point of his death, there's no establishment of the Messianic kingdom. But if it means not for himself, it means he died for others. He died for other people's sins. And either one we can take as the correct interpretation, translation, but in the end, both statements are true. At the time of his death, he did not establish the Messianic kingdom, and he didn't die for himself, he died for others. Now, Rashi's interpretation of this means that he simply will be no more, because he ascribed it to Agrippa. He will have nothing means he will simply cease to exist. Now, the second thing in the interval period, the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. Let's break this down. Now, the first element, remember, was the death of the Messiah, which happened anywhere between 30 to 35 years after his birth. But in this next phrase, notice, the people of the prince that shall come. The word people is in Hebrew as a definite article, a specific people, and they are the subject of the action. And notice it does not say, the prince shall destroy the city and the temple, but the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the temple. So the nationality of the people who destroyed the city and the temple, and the prince that shall come is of the same nationality, same ethnic identity. Now the prince that shall come, the prince, definite article, is going to be the one that people have often referred to as the Antichrist. And it's definite article because this is what we call in Hebrew grammar the article of previous reference, because Daniel already detailed a lot about the Antichrist twice before, once in chapter 7 and again in chapter 8. So this is the third reference to him now in chapter 9. Now Rashi interprets the prince that shall come to being Titus and his legions. And Titus, of course, was the one who destroyed Jerusalem. It's correct identification insofar it was the people that destroyed the city and the temple, and that indeed was the Roman nation. But it wouldn't be the same as identifying the prince that shall come, because Daniel does not say the prince that shall come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, but rather the people out of which the prince that shall come will come out of will destroy the city and the temple. So after Messiah is cut off, Jerusalem and the temple be destroyed, And this will occur in the year AD 70, 40 years after Messiah died, and the people who destroyed were the people of the Romans. So the Antichrist must come of the same ethnic identity, and he'll be a Gentile of Roman origin. A Gentile of Roman origin. This does not mean he'll be Italian, because the Roman ethnic identity was made up of a number of different tribes. The Italians were one, the Etruscans were another, and there were 3 other tribes and so on, but he will originate from one of those 5 basic units that made up the Roman ethnic identity. And then he adds, the end thereof shall be with the flood. The end of what? Thereof? The city and the temple. Now keep in mind, Jerusalem is 2,500 feet above sea level, so it's not likely to be a literal flood. But a common symbol of the meaning of the flood throughout the scriptures is, whenever the word flood is used symbolically, as it is right here, it refers to a military invasion. That is the meaning of flood. So initially it was under Emperor Vespasian. When Nero died, he became the new emperor. He had to leave the siege, so his son Titus came in to finish the siege. And so Jerusalem will be destroyed by a Roman invasion, first under Vespasian and first under Titus. Now Rashi interprets this passage specifically on Titus, and he says his end will be a curse, and he'll suffer total destruction. And the might of his reign will be washed away by Messiah and by the Messiah until after the final war with Gog and Magog. So he initiates the prince that shall come to be fulfilled by Titus, but ultimately the principle continue until the Gog and Magog war of Ezekiel 38 and 39. Only then will Israel finally be washed away from their sins. I should point out that in Gog and Magog war is limited in the Hebrew Bible to Ezekiel 38 and 39. It plays a large role in rabbinic theology. And they point out that the final war will be the Gog and Magog war. And they also innovated a 2 Messiah view. The first Messiah they refer to the Messiah, the son of Joseph, also son of Ephraim, and he will be the one to fulfill the suffering prophecies of the Messiah. He will be killed in the Gog and Magog war. But then will come the second Messiah, the son of David, who will win the Gog and Magog war, raise the first Messiah back to life, and inaugurate the Messianic kingdom. And so that is the emphasis of rabbinic interpretation of this specific passage. Now the third element in the interval is, and even unto the end shall be war. For the remainder of the interval, the land will suffer a long period of conflict and of war, and that will set the stage for the last 7 years. And he concludes the verse, desolations are determined. There'll be desolations for the state of the land as a result of so many wars over the centuries, and this is all determined, decreed by God himself. But we needed a specific event that tells us when the 77s begin, and that was the issuing of the decree. My preference, the decree of Cyrus, after Evangelicus, the decree of Artaxerxes and Nehemiah. And because the second subdivision was going to immediately follow the first division, there was no need of a special sign when the second division begins. But now because of this long interval that the text surely states where 3 things will occur between the 69th 7th and the 77th, there needs to be a specific element that will tell us exactly when the last 7 years begin, and that brings us to verse 27. Here we have the third division of the 77s. And the 70th 7 is a total of 7 years. The same 7 years is what we call the tribulation or great tribulation. But here we learn in this verse that the last 7 years will be subdivided into 2 equal parts, into 2 parts of 1,260 days, or 2 parts of 42 months, or elsewhere in Daniel and Revelation, a time and times and a half the time. So both have co-equal 3.5 years. And the starting point of the last 7 years is the first phrase of verse 27, and he shall make a firm covenant with many for 1/7. He shall make a firm covenant. That's the starting point of the 70th 7. The pronoun here goes back to his nearest antecedent, which is the prince that shall come in verse 26. In other words, the prince that shall come in verse 26 and the he who makes a covenant in verse 27 is the one and the same individual. And that is the prince that shall come in verse 26, better known in our circles as simply as the Antichrist. And he will make a firm covenant. The Hebrew word emphasizes he'll impose a covenant. It'll be a firm covenant, a strong covenant. And so the event that actually triggers the 7 years of tribulation is going to be the signing of this firm covenant. It will not be the rapture as such that will trigger the tribulation. The rapture will simply happen sometime before the tribulation, when before we do not know, but the trigger that will begin the 70th 7 is going to be the signing of the 7-year covenant. The Rashi interprets this as being, he will strengthen a covenant with the princes of Israel. He will strengthen a covenant with the princes of Israel. And so Titus assured them peace for 7 years, but during this time, he will abrogate the covenant. So it goes back, it was already fulfilled in the days of Titus. But Titus never had a 7-year covenant with the Jewish people. And furthermore, he says the covenant will be made with many, not with all, but with many. The Hebrew has a definite article. It is not a many, but the many. Definite article, and that will be the leadership of Israel because they alone are empowered to make a covenant of this nature. And they'll sign a 7-year covenant. And the covenant starts the last 7 years, and it was made to last for 7 years. Now, people often refer to this as a peace covenant. The Bible does not call it that. Rather, in the details given by Isaiah chapter 28, verses 14 to 22, Isaiah 28, verses 14 to 22, this is a military covenant that guarantees Israel's military security. It's not a peace covenant per se. And it will continue to last for 7 years. But then the next phrase says, in the middle of the 7, he will cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. In the middle of the 7, 3.5 years into the 7-year period, the covenant will be broken. And the sign of the violation and the breaking of the covenant is the forced cessation of the sacrifices and oblations of the tribulation temple. He shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. So there will be a forced cessation of the sacrificial system. What Antiochus IV Epiphanes did historically, as detailed in Daniel chapter 8, and again in chapter 11, the Antichrist will do so in prophecy. And we see this also to be fulfilled in Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2. And then Daniel says, and upon the wing of abomination shall come one that makes desolate. Upon the wing of abominations. The term wing refers to the pinnacle of the temple compound, and it emphasizes an overspreading influence. Exactly what that refers to is spelled out by Paul after the time of Daniel in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. The Antichrist will take over the Jewish temple, seat himself in it, proclaim himself to be God Almighty, call upon the whole world to worship him as God, and to signify their acceptance of his deity by taking the mark of 666. That part is detailed in Revelation chapter 13. The word abominations refers to an image or an idol. And there'll be an image or an idol of the Antichrist set up in the temple compound. This is what's indicated already by Daniel in Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, to be fulfilled in Matthew 24:15, when you see the abomination of desolation. And also Revelation 13, verses 14 and 15 specifies there'll be an image made of the Antichrist, which should be erected in the Holy of Holies of the Tribulation Temple, and that's the abomination of desolation. And then he says, shall come one that makes desolate. The one that's coming to make desolation would be the Antichrist. He will desolate the Jewish people because his goal in the second half of the tribulation will be to try to annihilate the Jews once and for all. And why is he trying to do this? Now, Satan knows that once the Messiah returns, then his career is over. Satan also knows that Jesus or the Messiah will not come back until the Jewish people ask him to come back. So if he can succeed to totally annihilate the Jews before there can be a national salvation and a second coming, then he'll be safe forever. That's why he's always had this antagonistic war against the Jews since the time of Abraham. And now in the tribulation, he knows this time is short, and the second half is to inaugurate a Nazi-like worldwide persecution of the Jews in order to annihilate the Jews to avoid the second coming. And that will be his target. And then the text says, and even to the full end in that determined shall wrath be poured out upon the desolate. And even to the full end, here again the same word used twice before, to finish or to complete, to end, to finish, the completion of the 70th seven. And that determined was decreed beforehand will now be finally fully decreed and fulfilled. And this event was already decreed in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 23, and Isaiah 28, verse 22. So tribulation will not go beyond its predetermined duration, even to the exact day. And the point of Matthew 24, verse 22 is that the persecution of the Jews on the worldwide level will last for exactly 3.5 years, exactly 42 months, exactly 1,260 days, and would not be allowed to last 1 second beyond this allotment of time, because if it were allowed to last any longer, no Jews would survive, but the Jews will survive. A good third of them will survive, and therefore you're not allowed the persecution to continue between 1 second beyond its predetermined time. And then he says, shall wrath be poured out upon the desolate. The desolate are the Jewish people living in the second half of the tribulation, being targeted in a Nazi-like persecution. And the desolator, his destruction at the second coming, at the very last day of the 77, will bring this massive persecution to an end. Here is Rashi's rabbinic interpretation. The abominable government shall last until the day when destruction and severance decreed for it in the days of the Messiah King will pour down upon it. So as he interprets verses 24 to 27, some of it is not Messianic, some of it is somewhat Messianic, though it's more focused on the Messianic kingdom and things of that nature. And so it's kind of a mixed bag of interpretations, but I've given you the basic verse by verse and phrase by phrase meaning of the passage. So let me read you a couple of paraphrases of what this passage means. First one, he shall cause to prevail a covenant with the many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he shall cause the sacrifice and offering to cease, and upon the wing of detestable things desolating, even unto the consummation, and that determined shall wrath be poured out on the desolator. A second option, the Antichrist will cause sacrifice and offering to cease, and in their place shall erect, even unto the end, causing overspreading influence, a detestable statue in the temple, desolating in effect of the duration of 3.5 years period. In view of all the desolating activity God has determined beforehand will be poured out on making it desolate. So I've given you the basic verse by verse, phrase by phrase interpretation of what it actually says, but I've also given you a rabbinic interpretation by one of the standard rabbis of the Middle Ages that still most Jews quote most of the time, and that is Rashi. And so that is our discussion on Daniel 9, 24 to 27. You're
Okay.
on.
Thank you very much. Very informative.
Thank you.
I appreciate you bringing Rashi into the discussion. I was keeping an eye on some comments through social media and various things, and some questions come up. I was wondering if you could respond to. Some folks have said that our interpretation of Daniel 9 cannot be accurate on the grounds that the term to cut off can be used to describe cutting off an evil thing. So if it does apply to Yeshua, then that would mean that Yeshua is evil, which would contradict our theology on another level. Is there any legitimacy to this claim?
The Hebrew is karat, which was used mostly in execution of violating the law and things of that nature. And it would apply to him only not that he was evil, but he was accused of being evil. And he was accused by the Sanhedrin. He was turned over to the Roman authorities. And the Roman authorities gave him the crucifixion was for criminals. So he suffered a criminal's death. And that fits what the word cut off means. He suffered a criminal's death. But the emphasis is he was an innocent sufferer. He was accused of being guilty of specific sin, but being guilty of even being a rebel. So of course he was cut off by karat. That actually fits it perfectly because it was not God who cut him off. It was the Romans who cut him off.
Okay. So simple answer, he was executed as a criminal, but he was innocent.
Exactly.
Okay. So here's another one. We have Daniel's 70th week, which we understand to be the 7-year tribulation period. In Daniel 9:27, the ESV has, "And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week," that's the 7 years, "and for half of the week he shall put an end to the sacrifice and offering," which we would understand is the 3.5-year period at the end.
Right.
A lot of people would point to this to say that the rapture of the church will occur at the middle point of the tribulation rather than the beginning of the tribulation. What's a good response to that?
Well, first of all, the rapture is not even discussed in that passage, number one.
Okay.
And number two, it's never discussed in any segment of the tribulation. It's not discussed as happening in the first half, not discussed as happening in the middle or at the 3/4 period or afterwards. And if you look at Revelation as a text, the church is mentioned frequently in the first 5 chapters, which are events that are before the tribulation. From chapter 6 to chapter 18, which is most of the book, and all under 7 years of tribulation, the church is not mentioned a single time. It's mentioned again only in chapters 19 to 22, which are events that follow the tribulation. What you see in Revelation is seen in every other scriptures. The church will maybe mention before and after, but never once within. And nobody who's mid-trib, 3/4 trib, post-trib can never show you any passage in a tribulation context that mentions the Keilah or Ecclesia or the church. It simply does not exist. And real relevant passages would be passages like Luke 21, verses 34 through 36, 1 Thessalonians 1, verses 9 and 10, 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 1 to 11, Revelation chapter 3, verse 10, and at the end of Revelation 19, verses 6 to 8, it shows the church is already in heaven before the second coming, and she didn't just then arrive, she's been in heaven for some time because she's undergone the entire judgment seat of the Messiah, detailed in 1 Corinthians 3, verses 10 to 15, and therefore therefore all that's showing them the bride at the wedding ceremony is the righteous acts of the saints. All the wood they stubble has been burned away, all the gold, silver, precious stone has been purified. So these they're clear teachings about a future rapture. And nobody who believes that the church will be any part of tribulation can show us the mention of a church in any part of tribulation. The midpoint of tribulation is the abomination of desolation in Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2. The church is not mentioned in chapters 6 to 10. the church disappears by the end of chapter 5.
Okay, thank you very much. Now you mentioned the people of the prince to come who desecrate the temple. We can understand that as being Rome historically. So we know that this coming Antichrist figure will be from Rome. Yet we don't currently have a Rome. You said that it's not going to be from Italy. So if I understand your perspective, are you saying that he would come from the territory that was Rome at the time of the desecration?
No, it doesn't have to mean that. It just means ethnically he's born of someone who is of lineage of among those 5 basic tribes that made up the Roman identity. I'm a Jew, but I was not born in Israel. I was born in Russia. I live in America. I studied in Israel. And so most Jews who live today were not born in Israel, but they're still Jews. So it's your ethnic identity that you're born from. It's not the location.
Okay.
So I never would teach that the Christ will come from Italy.
So he could come literally from anywhere in the world, as long as his lineage goes.
Has that ethnic line present.
Would you say that there are any other ethnical requirements that this Antichrist must come from? I've heard some say that he has to be Assyrian. Are there any other nationalities that he would need to be a part of, or just Roman?
He might be born what used to be Assyria, which today would be northern Iraq. But again, that would just be guessing situations.
Okay.
The only ethnic identity actually provided in the biblical text is as in the passage here in Daniel. So he'll be ethnically of some Roman descent, but he won't be it doesn't say anything about his religious beliefs. Doesn't mean he'll be a Muslim. And knowing and understanding Israel's mindset, they will never sign a 7-year covenant with a Muslim nation that would guarantee Israel's military security, whether the government is right-wing or left-wing or centrist. None of those elements are going to trust any Islamic state to guarantee Israel's military security.
Okay. Every now and then you see someone emerge. That's probably the wrong word. You see someone accuse another person, usually some celebrity somewhere, of being the Antichrist. Usually they'll twist around some kind of numbers to affiliate him with 666 or something. Would you say that this kind of practice should be discouraged, that we can't really know who the Antichrist is just by looking around at current events?
This point is a bit too soon to know if the Antichrist is even alive or not. We do not know at this stage of the game. Secondly, we must remind believers, our blessed hope is not to identify who the Antichrist is. Our blessed hope is the Lord to return to the sky, to the clouds, and resurrect the saints of the body, the Messiah, and catch up the living saints of the body, and we meet them in the air. That's our blessed hope. And so on. People, I have a bunch of books in my library that states who the Antichrist is over the years, and all those books are now out of print because these people have come and gone and so on. So I think it's just foolish to try to identify the Antichrist at this stage of the game. But rapture will come any time between now and the signing of the covenant. That's our blessed hope.
Amen.